My name is David, and this is The Big Shut-In. So it's Saturday, April 11th, day 27 of my family's lockdown. And, watching the national dialogue around all this start to open up and start to get weird and divisive as ever is bound to do. Everything in this country is weird and divisive, but it strikes me how much people are talking about philosophy and what the government should and shouldn't be allowed to do, but also talking about this disease as if it were theoretical. It might happen, things might get one way or another way, and I think it's just really important that we all remember that this thing is real and that real people are actually getting very sick, and not like getting the flu sick, but, going to the hospital sick, intensive care sick. That's really happening to people by the thousands, particularly here in New York. And I've been real lucky that I don't have any close friends or family or, close work acquaintances or anything who have ended up in the hospital. But, it's right there. For me, it's right there. It was 2 doors down. My friend Phil, who is a guy I know and like and say hi to, and we bump into each other all the time when we're gardening in the front yard. And he's a doctor himself, rheumatologist. He got this and got very sick and was in the hospital for several days. And he was kind enough to talk to me and share that experience and give us a little insight into what it's actually like to have a bad case of COVID-19. And so I'm very happy that he was willing to do that, and I'm very happy to be able to share it with you. So here's Phil. So how are you feeling right
now? I feel, pretty much close to 100%. The only thing is for the past week or so, I've been saying, I'm going to try to do some exercise today. And I just haven't gotten around to it or been up for it. That's the only thing where
I've been doing that. I've been doing that for decades.
Well, that's one of my releases is exercising. So then I'm like, let me just sort of, do some, and even simple, yoga, not saying yoga is simple, but meaning like nothing overtly, grossly strenuous. And I'm like, and I just, I'm not quite up for that yet. Yeah, the mind is willing, but the body isn't quite there yet. So
tell me about how this began. Like when did you start feeling sick and
I started feeling sick. Actually, I put up some wood paneling in the house on a Saturday, like the second weekend in March. And at the end of the night, we were going to, watch a movie with the kids, and I just felt totally wiped. And I'm like, wow, I'm really wiped out, and my muscles are really sore. All my muscles are really sore. And I was just using a drill, essentially. But I'm like, oh, that's kind of odd. And then I started to have chills, and then I checked my temperature, and I had a fever. And then that Saturday night was the starting point, sort of very suddenly, of having recurrent daily fevers for the fevers continued for 10 days, but it was around 8 days of fever that I was ultimately admitted to the hospital. But it started just with fever and significant muscle aches and a mild headache and profound fatigue, to the point that I was in bed all day, but I was sleeping probably 16 hours a day. And then I was isolating myself because of my concern that I had COVID or some other virus. And so I was also just essentially staying in my room, and then with, my wife bringing my meals to the bed.
Was it different from other things you've had before?
Well, I've been lucky enough that as an adult, I think I've had fever 3 times, and for a day. I mean, I've never had fever even 2 days in a row that I can recall. And the fatigue was debilitating. I mean, it was to the point where it wasn't just that I was keeping myself isolated from my family, but the concept of having the strength to get out of bed was not even there. I was so exhausted I could barely move. Even it was an effort to get to the bathroom, which then unfortunately progressed, which prompted going to the ER.
So what does that mean, progress? Like, why did you decide?
Well, I initially, when I was on the Saturday night, I had fever. And on Sunday, I called one of my friends who works in an emergency room in Brooklyn. I just called him and he said, listen, I'm in the ER. Come on in and I'll just check you out for COVID. So I came in and he did this very multiple painful swabs to check for COVID and another viral panel. Swab is a euphemism for what they do, but it's sort of a painful, it's something like a brush that you would use to the kind of brush that you use to clean out bottles and stuff. There's a smaller version of that, which they shove into your nose. And the 4th time that they did it, I'm certain that the doctor said, listen, you have to go very, very deep into his nose to make sure we get an adequate sample, which is why when the nurse came in to do it, she brought 2 other nurses to help hold me down in case. But it's a very unpleasant experience to have them swab put this brush into your nose to get a sample.
Wow, I hadn't heard that before. In fact, I remember there was, I mean, there's so much back and forth on the internet, but I remember there was people sort of making fun of the president for saying it was an uncomfortable test you wouldn't want to go through.
Oh no, it's no. I mean, no one who has had the test would say that. I mean, my wife's boss, who is a doctor, she went in to get it, and she told my wife that she almost fainted. It's very uncomfortable, and it's surprisingly uncomfortable. It is a sort of fairly rigid, coarse brush that is shoved in deep into your nose. I mean, it's nothing like where one would not do it, but I mean, it's definitely an unpleasant test for sure. And then I came home, and that was my first visit to the ER, which was the Sunday after I got sick. And then it wasn't until the following Saturday when I was still febrile. So I was still with fever 7-8 days in, and then my wife said, and I agreed with her, that we should probably get rechecked. And I didn't have my COVID results yet. So there was such a backlog that actually my initial COVID test that I had done at a hospital in Brooklyn, I didn't get the results for 3 weeks. So initially they weren't going to admit me because they were like, listen, your labs don't look so bad. You're able to maintain your oxygen, and you probably have COVID, but we don't want to bring you in necessarily. And I was like, okay, that sounds reasonable. And I called my wife to pick me up, and she, who is almost always the voice of reason and intelligence, was like, she said, no, you can't come home. She's like, if you deteriorate, you're going to have to go to the local hospital, which is not a great hospital, and you can't even walk across to the curb, which is true. And I was being, I guess, maybe an overly passive patient, perhaps, but also I did not psychologically want to go into the hospital. I absolutely wanted to avoid, firstly, hospitals are scary places, even though I work in hospitals. But B, if I didn't have COVID, I knew that I was going into a place that had a significant amount of COVID and other sort of scary pathogens lurking around, and I didn't want to expose myself unnecessarily to that. But then my wife said, listen, you are clinically worse from a 24 hours previously. And that's why she was like, we're going to the emergency room. And then she essentially said, no, I think you need to get admitted. And then I spoke to the doctor, and the doctor said, of course, we'll admit you, and we'll admit you for a day. And then it turned into 3.5 days. I had, there's not much of a discussion, but there's a discussion about sort of cognitive issues with COVID infections and any viral infection. But for me, a day or two before I was admitted, I started to have significant, I don't know if it was anxiety or just self-doubt, but I was normally I consider myself that I can kind of catch on to things and think through problems fairly clearly, and I like complex, challenging riddles in clinical medicine, but I felt extraordinarily unsure of my intelligence, my cognitive abilities, and my ability to pay attention to difficult tasks, to the point that I was worried that I was not that I was not a competent doctor, and that I would never be a competent doctor. It got to that point of significant self-doubt, which was all the virus sort of poking around in my brain and making me think unclearly, I think, and that was another thing that was very different. And my wife has never heard me say that before, and to the point that then she spoke to my chair and said, Phil is really not good, and then my chair sort of got into action and made sure that she checked on me regularly, which was very sweet.
You're lucky that she insisted.
I am very lucky, very, very, very lucky that my wife insisted that I get admitted, and they do did multiple labs on me, and then when I developed diarrhea, they also did various stool studies as well. So one of my lab tests was a CRP, which is a non-specific inflammatory marker, meaning that it can be up in various infections, it can be up in autoimmune disease, it can be up in cancer, but this lab test is normally less than 9 as normal, and mine was 250, which is extraordinarily high. And then there's another blood test called a ferritin, which is another marker of inflammation, among other things. And the ferritin is supposed to be, say, less than 200, and mine was 3,000. So,
wow.
And then they had done 2 chest X-rays on me, which showed something that looked like a double pneumonia, like that I had pneumonia in both of my lungs. So the thought was that I had this underlying COVID viral infection with a superimposed bacterial infection. So they treated me with 2 different antibiotics while I was in the hospital that I continued in pill form after I was discharged.
What was the treatment like in the hospital? What were they doing for you?
It was sort of, making sure I was eating. They gave me fluids briefly because I had no appetite while I was in the hospital, and that was the only time I had no appetite. But I also had really impressive amount of thirst, which was very interesting. Like, and I'm usually not a big drinker. I don't drink much water during the day, but I was profoundly thirsty. And the other unusual phenomenon that I had while I was in the hospital was that I had a powerful aversion, or I could taste salt, any salt on food. It was repugnant, actually. In fact, I'm a big chocoholic, so I wasn't feeling well. I said, well, give me the dinner tray, but I want to have a brownie on it. And I couldn't finish the brownie because I could taste the salt in the brownie. And most brownies, obviously, we don't taste them. They don't taste salty, but this was just, I had an exquisite sensitivity, or I was able to detect in my palate salt, which was a noxious taste.
Do you think that was all part of the dehydration, that you were your body was like, I don't need any salt?
No, I think because COVID, there are these unusual reports of people having issues losing their sense of smell.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And smell and taste are obviously linked, and I think that this was my version of this sort of unusual sensory aberration, and it was only for about 3 days or so, around the time that I was hospitalized.
What was it like in the hospital? What was it like in that ward, in that section?
You know, when you say ward, I was so isolated. There was no concept of ward. I was literally, to a large extent, felt like a prisoner. You were kept in a room, and there was no contact from the outside, and everybody that comes to see you is gowned and gloved and masked, and I mean, they were all wonderful and sweet, but it was very, very, very isolating. It was and appropriately so, but still a very bizarre phenomenon. And also, I had gone into the hospital. I had gone into the emergency room not thinking I was going to get admitted, but then I didn't have my phone charger. I didn't have another change of underwear. I didn't have anything to prepare for being, admitted. And that was another tricky thing, because then even getting my phone charger and underwear was a little bit more of a complicated process, with my wife bringing a little care package to the security desk, and then my chair potentially asking the chief of oncology to see if she could get my phone charger and underwear and ultimately the nurse went down and got it. But there were several different very sweet people that were willing to help me out, and that was very, very sweet. But it was extraordinarily isolating and terrifying to be in the hospital. Also knowing that, when you come in with mild respiratory distress, and you, as a doctor, you know that you're worsening. If they suddenly start giving you oxygen, and you're feeling more breathless, and you know that this disease can progress to require mechanical ventilation and being connected to a respirator, and you know that in and of itself carries a risk of morbidity and death, all of these things flood your mind at a rapid rate, and then once again you are completely physically isolated from other people who care about you, and that's also even more upsetting, or equally upsetting perhaps, because you can't even vent, on the phone. But I didn't even have the capacity to talk on the phone, because it didn't have enough of the respiratory reserve to talk on the phone. So when I talked to my wife or my brother, I think I talked to my parents. It was very brief, because I couldn't physically talk on the phone for any significant period of time.
I mean, if you couldn't interact with anyone, you couldn't talk to anybody, what did you do for 3 days? Did you watch TV?
No, actually. So what was I doing in the hospital? The answer is nothing. I did not even, I think I had the television on maybe in the 3.5 days I was in the hospital. I think the TV was on maybe an hour. So I had no books. I was not listening to music. I was either sleeping or awake, just sort of staring blankly at the ceiling.
Wow.
Yeah. And I had no appetite. I had, it was a very bizarre state. Just a very bizarre, and a state I've never even been in. Everybody's been jet lagged or had the flu, but this was unlike anything I had experienced, in which I wasn't bored. It wasn't like I was bored, which is, like, oh my God.
Catatonic or something, like.
Yes, but I had just so little physical and mental strength. There was nothing in reserve. Literally, everything was just like, all right, let's pump the blood and get the air into the lungs. It was very I had gone into very sort of survival mode, I think, and everything was just functioning at its most basic level with no additional gas.
It's like the scene in Star Trek or something when they're like essential systems only.
Yeah,
like, only run life support. Like no, to turn off
You're
all
like
the
literally
screens.
floating around in space. That's it, and the lights. Some of the lights are on, and the oxygen's still going, and but also even food was of no interest to me, and I'm a big food person. So not that hospital food is wonderful, but I mean even eating food, I just said I didn't have any hunger, which was also an unusual phenomenon for me too. But yeah, I did nothing, and then I had I would have these paroxysms of cough where I would suddenly and very unpredictably, even from changing positions, have these episodes where I would be intractably coughing, probably for the longest period, about a minute. But during that period of time, I would have the sensation, at least, of total breathlessness, that I not only was coughing intractably, but I also could not, or felt that I could not catch my breath and could not get air into my lungs, that was the worst of everything that I experienced. That was the worst sensation, because I literally felt that I felt as if I could not breathe, and I had never had any unpleasant sensation like that before in my life. That was the most upsetting.
Were you intubated?
I was not intubated. I just required nasal cannula for a day, half a day.
What's that?
Nasal cannula are these plastic prongs that give oxygen in through the nose. Yeah, that was just because they saw that my oxygen saturation dropped. And then, because if you saw me and I was lying completely still in a bed, I didn't look that bad, I think, except I was breathing quickly. But if I had to go up and go walk 6 steps to the bathroom, that's when I would deteriorate.
It struck me a couple times while you were talking through all that as horrible and terrifying and all of those things that was, it strikes me that you're very lucky to be a doctor and be married to a doctor and have her know, no, you need to be admitted now, and be able to call in favors at the hospital and look at tests and all, I'm sure you got seen faster at the ER, because you said you went to see your friend. And
and sometimes ignorance is actually bliss, right? So what I'm saying is, like, sometimes knowing more is not good, like, oh, if you tell me the labs, I'm like, I would have absolutely freaked out, because some of those labs were just really extraordinarily crappy labs and signified pending doom. And so, like, if it's like, oh, yeah, that is kind of high, doc, like, oh, yeah, the blood tests are a little bit high, don't worry about it. I'm like, don't tell me not to worry about it. Those are awful lab tests. And then knowing, like, how other doctors may be thinking about your clinical case sometimes can be reassuring and not reassuring. And but I never once looked at my monitor. It's by my head, so I'm on a bed and the monitor's at my head facing out. But I didn't do that once, which I also think was a protective response. Like, I don't want to see it, I don't want to see what my numbers are, and also there's an element of faith. And I think that in terms of the people taking care of you, and I'm like, no, I'm here and I'm trusting the doctors and the nurses to look out for me, and that's truly what I did. And I really left my fate in their very capable hands, luckily. And I was very happy with the care that I received as well, which is also nice, because when it's your hospital, you're like, wow, this is a great hospital. I'm really proud to work here, So that's also a positive thing, I think.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's great.
Yeah. But my wife she just has the wisdom of that's not being a doctor. I think that's just being a wise person. So that's just a fortunate.
You're lucky to be married to one of those, then, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. That's just an extra plus.
When you got better, did you get better sort of all at once? Did you wake up one day and feel a lot better, or was it a more gradual process?
Absolutely a gradual I mean, so it was not like, that I woke up in the morning and stretched my arms above my head and then went for a jog on the beach. That no way. It was and I could just feel it I could feel it. I've never even had asthma or pneumonia in the past, and I could literally feel this heaviness in my lung when walking. And unfortunately, when I left the hospital, they made me take an ambulette like home, which I thought was a bit much. And then when my kids were waiting for me outside of the door, and my wife was waiting, like picture perfect, and when I got up and got onto the stretcher in the hospital to get into the ambulette, I was fine. But then, probably because I was excited to be home too, I got off the ambulette. I walked off the ambulette, and I took like 3 steps and immediately started to have these paroxysms of cough and breathlessness and one of these attacks again, which is not what I wanted. I didn't want my kids to see and or my wife, and that's not what they want to see, and I don't want so I don't look too much better because I immediately have to sit down, and I actually ripped off my mask because I just felt that I couldn't breathe. And then even if you have a thin piece of paper over your face, psychologically it feels like you can't breathe. And then of course I'm like, and I'm exposing my kids to my deadly germs, and so that homecoming was not as Norman Rockwellian as I had hoped, but and it was a very, very gradual recovery. And I still, even when I had come home, I stayed in isolation from my family for an additional 3 days. Again, meaning isolation, meaning with the exception of going to the bathroom, just physically staying in my room again.
And that was, what, about 2 weeks ago when you came home?
Yeah. So I came home a week ago from Friday.
Well, so do you have a sense of when did you stop being contagious? Do you have a sense of that? Are you contagious now?
Some of this stuff is not totally clear. One of the things is that I'm essentially not coughing, and I have no overt symptoms, and I don't have any fever, and that has not been for weeks. In other words, 2 days before I was discharged from the hospital was my last fever. So for 2.5 weeks I haven't had any fever. So according to the recommendation of the various hospitals where I work, they're sort of saying, no, you're okay, and that you're not overtly contagious. Still, I personally would, and so that means in my house, I am not wearing a mask. I am not, I'm not in isolation. I'm around, sitting on a couch with my family watching a movie. But even when I came out of isolation, I didn't hug or kiss my family for like a week probably. So even though I followed the rules pretty much of what, the guidelines that are not clearly evidence-based, but the guidelines that the hospitals are providing in terms of what is safe to be around other human beings again.
I'm not going to hug or kiss you for a while.
No, all right. It's okay. I am hoping that my exposure has conferred some immunity to me and that I can actually now work helping. Oddly enough, when I had to go back into the hospital, back to work, the patients, the first patient that I happen to see is one of my patients that happens to have COVID. So I think, of course, I made my children a little bit anxious, like after, recovering from COVID, then choosing, well, I mean, it's my job, like going into the hospital to see a patient that has this, potentially very noxious viral infection is a little anxiety inducing to the kids. But then I was telling my kids that I'm like, no, I think I actually have some immunity, and I am still doing all of the precautions that any other healthcare provider would do, so, which is, protect yourself when you're going in and minimizing the extent of your exposure and the different things that we can do.
When did you go back to work?
I went back to work 2 weeks ago.
Oh, you did? Like almost as soon as you came home?
Because initially, my initial back to work was telemedicine. So I wasn't physically needing to leave my house. So initially, when I went back to work, it was phone calls or video calls with patients from my house. So that was back to work. And then for the past week and a half, I've been physically going in to see patients in the hospital.
Well, this has been amazing, man. Thank you for talking to me and sharing all this. It's the clearest view into what this might actually be like for someone that I've had yet,
Yeah, it was just, it was a real crappy experience. And the other thing is, like, when I was really worsening, one of the most terrifying, I'm 48, so like I was like, oh my gosh, and this is I've never been in a car accident. I haven't, I have not been sick in my life. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, what if this is it? And like, what if this is it? And I go into a hospital and I don't come out, and at 48, when you're contemplating your own mortality, and, that's a terrifying experience, and
Yeah.
that was like, I'm like, well, what if it goes sour, and you can only do as much as you can. And I'm not, when you come in and if this next day you're like, oh, wow, I feel much better, then that's great. But if the next day you feel worse, you're like, all right, I'm buying myself an ICU bed. And then from an ICU bed, you can go to other places that I was not looking forward to, So that sort of, you had said, isn't it sort of good to be a doctor? Sometimes it's not, because you're aware of progression of disease and the ramifications and the result of what could happen if your disease progresses, which is not, rosy. So that was another psychological challenge, I think. And the psychological challenges, I think, were just as difficult as the physical challenge.
My name is David Hoffman, and this is The Big Shut-In, a production of Race Car Radio. If you have feedback for me or have a story that you'd like to share, you can reach out to me at TheBigShutIn@racecarradio.com.